I never imagined that motherhood would one day drag me into a courtroom, sitting opposite the very boy I raised with every ounce of love I had. Yet there I was, staring at my son Daniel as he refused to meet my eyes. People whispered around us, confused about why a grown man was suing his own mother for ignoring boundaries. It sounded absurd, almost laughable, but nothing about this moment felt funny. It felt like the final crack in something that had been breaking for far longer than either of us had admitted. But as I watched him fidget in his seat, the weight of what he didn't know pressed against my chest, the truth that had protected him from his entire life. A truth that, once spoken, would change everything he thought he knew about me, about himself, and about the family that had shaped him. Daniel wasn't always distant. When he was young, he used to cling to me like I was the only safe place in the world. Every night, he slept with his tiny hand wrapped around my finger. I used to think that bond was unbreakable. But life teaches you that love can fracture under pressure you never expected. It started small. After he turned 15, he began asking more questions, mainly about his father. I always gave the same answer, that his father wasn't around and that we were better off without him. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. As he grew older, he seemed to resent that answer more and more. His face hardened every time the topic came up, as if my refusal to explain more was a personal attack. I thought I was protecting him. I didn't want him to feel the pain of knowing who his father really was, or what had happened. But silence can feel like betrayal, even when the intention behind it is love. Things got worse when Daniel married. His wife, Melissa, was sharp-tongued and skeptical of everything I did. She believed boundaries should be rigid, cold, and absolute. She didn't like how close Daniel and I used to be. She didn't like that he asked for my advice. She didn't like that he visited me without informing her. Slowly, Daniel began creating distance, not because he wanted to, but because he was being pushed to choose sides. Every time he visited, Melissa would call repeatedly, demanding to know where he was. Eventually, those visits became rare. Then they became non-existent. Soon, I only saw him at holidays, and even then he looked uncomfortable, as if stepping inside my home was somehow crossing an invisible line drawn by someone who didn't even understand our history. The lawsuit came 3 months after Daniel and Melissa's son, my first grandson, was born. I had gone to the hospital to see the baby. I brought gifts, foods, things I knew Daniel loved growing up. When I walked into the room, Melissa's expression went ice cold. She said they had told everyone they wanted 0 visitors for the first 48 hours. It was a lie. There were already people inside the room when I arrived. I apologized, stepped back, and offered to leave. Daniel looked conflicted, but said nothing. A week later, I dropped by their home unannounced with a basket of baby clothes I had knitted myself. Melissa didn't let me pass the doorway. She handed the basket back and slammed the door. I stood there for a long moment, clutching the basket, wondering what I had done wrong. 2 weeks later, a sheriff delivered a letter to my door. I thought it was a mistake, but it wasn't. Daniel had filed a restraining order request for boundary violations, claiming that I repeatedly showed up without notice and caused emotional distress to their family. I sat on my sofa for hours, reading the paper over and over, trying to understand how something so small had escalated into something so cruel. I never yelled. I never barged in. I never raised my voice. I simply tried to visit my only child and my newborn grandson. How could that be twisted into harm? I kept waiting for Daniel to call, to explain, to tell me it was all something Melissa had pushed him to do. But he never did. The courtroom felt cold when my case was called. Daniel sat rigid, avoiding my gaze. Melissa sat next to him with a triumphant expression that sliced right through my heart. When the judge asked Daniel why he believed I violated boundaries, his voice trembled. He said I ignored their requests for space, that I made him uncomfortable, that I was too controlling. Every word felt like a blade. I had spent years sacrificing for him, working 2 jobs, skipping meals, wearing the same coat winter after winter, so he could have school supplies and camp trips. Yet here he was describing me like a villain. But the judge wasn't convinced. She asked him for proof. He faltered. He looked at Melissa, then at the floor. For the first time that day, he looked like the frightened little boy I remembered. The judge asked if there was deeper conflict behind this. Daniel swallowed hard but said nothing. Then the judge turned to me.
She offered me the chance to speak.
I had planned to defend myself calmly, but something inside me cracked. Years of silence. Years of protecting him. Years of carrying a truth so heavy it had hollowed out pieces of me. And now that very silence was being used as a weapon against me. I looked at Daniel, and instead of anger, I felt overwhelming sorrow. So, I told the truth. I told him that his father wasn't absent by choice, that he had been dangerous, that I had left to protect Daniel, that I had spent years hiding from a man who hurt me in ways Daniel could never imagine. I told him that the reason I never explained more was because I didn't want him growing up feeling unwanted or unworthy. I wanted his childhood to be free from that darkness. I had chosen silence because I believed it was the kinder option. But silence also created emptiness he had filled with resentment. The courtroom grew still. Daniel stared at me, his face draining of color. I told him about the night I ran away with him as a baby, clutching him so tightly my arms ached. I told him about the shelters, the fear, the police reports. I told him how I worked endlessly to give him normalcy, birthdays, school events, warm meals, while building a life from scratch, so he would never have to feel the instability I lived through. And I told him that every time he pushed me away, I assumed it was my punishment for never telling him everything. I thought I was doing the right thing, but maybe I had been wrong. By the time I finished speaking, tears were streaming down Daniel's face. His breathing was uneven, and he couldn't even look at Melissa. He whispered, barely audible, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" And I answered simply, "Because you deserved a childhood free from monsters." The judge ended the hearing there. She dismissed the restraining order request and encouraged both of us to seek mediation. But Daniel wasn't listening. He walked out of the courtroom and collapsed into my arms the second the doors closed. For a long moment, he just held me like he did when he was small, shaking and apologizing, begging for forgiveness I wasn't even sure he owed me. He said Melissa had convinced him I was overbearing and manipulative, that withholding details about his father was proof I was hiding something shameful. He had believed her because I never defended myself, because I never told him the truth, because love, when silent for too long, can be misunderstood. That day changed everything. I didn't get angry. I didn't blame him. I just felt relief that he finally knew why I made the choices I made. Healing didn't happen overnight. It came slowly. Daniel started visiting again, this time without Melissa. He asked questions he had been too afraid to ask before. And I answered them, not with fear, but with honesty. Weeks later, he brought my grandson to meet me properly. I held the baby in my arms and felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. Daniel told me he was seeking counseling and reevaluating his marriage. He said he didn't want to repeat the patterns of the past. He didn't want his son growing up in confusion and resentment. He wanted to break the cycle. Looking at him, I realized that painful moments can become turning points. Sometimes the deepest fractures reveal the truth we desperately need to confront. Sometimes the people we love hurt us because they themselves are hurting. And sometimes healing begins the moment we decide to stop hiding. I had spent years trying to protect Daniel from a truth that shaped our entire lives. But in the end, it wasn't the truth that hurt him. It was the silence. Now, as I stand at the doorway watching him buckle his infant son into the car seat, I feel a quiet hope blooming again. A hope that maybe this time, our family story can continue without the shadows of the past guiding our steps. And as he waves goodbye, I wonder how many families could heal if they dared to face the truths they've kept buried for far too long.